There is a particular kind of person who spends their 20s and 30s feeling quietly out of step with their own timeline, while others around them accumulate visible markers of achievement, promotions, recognition, the steady architecture of a life that looks complete from the outside. This person remains, in some essential way, unfinished. Not failing, not lost, simply unready asterisk in a manner that defies easy explanation. Carl Jung, the Swiss psychiatrist whose work fundamentally reshaped how we understand the human psyche, spent decades observing exactly this pattern in his clinical practice. And what he noticed repeatedly was that the deepest, most stable transformations in his patients' lives rarely arrived early. They arrived in midlife, often after a prolonged period that looked, from the outside, like stagnation. This video is not a claim that Jung designed a formula for delayed success. He did not. What he offered was something more interesting and considerably more useful. A framework for understanding why some people are simply not built to peak on the schedule the world expects of them, and why that delay is not a malfunction, but a different kind of architecture entirely. To understand this, we have to start with the concept Jung considered the central task of human life: individuation. In Jung's framework, individuation is the lifelong process by which a person integrates the disparate parts of their psyche, the conscious mind, the unconscious, the persona we present to the world, and the shadow we suppress, into a coherent, authentic self. It is not a single event. It is a gradual unfolding, often invisible to the person undergoing it, that can take decades to reach any kind of completion. This is where Jung's most relevant insight enters the picture. He observed that human psychological life tends to divide into two broad halves, each governed by a different task. The first half of life, in Jung's observation, is largely occupied with building an ego strong enough to function in the external world, establishing a career, a social identity, a persona capable of meeting the demands of family, work, and culture. This is necessary work. It is also, by its nature, outward-facing asterisk. It rewards adaptation, performance, and the construction of an image that satisfies external expectations. The second half of life, Jung argued, requires something fundamentally different. It requires turning inward, confronting the parts of the self that were suppressed or ignored in the rush to build a functional ego. This is the stage where the shadow, the unconscious, and the deeper layers of identity finally demand attention. And critically, Jung observed that a person cannot rush this stage. It happens when it happens, often triggered by crisis, loss, or simply the slow accumulation of internal pressure that can no longer be ignored. For a specific kind of temperament, one Jung associated with introversion, deep introspection, and a resistance to premature self-definition, this second-half work does not wait politely until a convenient career milestone. It often intrudes early, disrupting the first-half project of external achievement before that project has fully matured. The result is a person who, in their 20s and 30s, appears to be moving slower than their peers, not because they lack capability, but because a significant portion of their psychological energy is already being redirected toward internal integration that most people do not begin until much later. This is not a flaw in the timeline, it is a different timeline. The world built around us is structured almost entirely around first-half values: speed, visible achievement, external validation arriving on schedule. It is not built to recognize or reward a person whose deepest work is happening beneath the surface, unobserved, unmeasured, and frequently mistaken, by others and sometimes by the person themselves, for falling behind. But Jung's clinical observation suggests something quietly important. The people who do this inner work early, who feel its pull before the culture says they are allowed to, are not behind. They are simply front-loading the harder, slower, less visible task. The one that, once complete, tends to produce something the early achievers rarely have access to. Something we will examine closely in the next part. A success built not on a persona performing well, but on a self that has actually become whole. There is a moment that arrives, often without warning, in the life of someone who has spent years quietly out of step with their own timeline. It does not announce itself as a breakthrough. It rarely feels triumphant. More often, it arrives as a kind of exhaustion, a sense that the persona they have been maintaining, the version of themselves built to satisfy external expectations, can no longer be sustained. Jung had a name for the work that begins at exactly this point. He called it confronting the shadow. The shadow, in Jung's framework, is not a metaphor for villainy or hidden evil. It is simply everything about ourselves that we have pushed out of conscious awareness because it did not fit the image we were building. The ambitions we suppressed because they seemed impractical. The sensitivities we hid because they seemed inconvenient. The parts of our temperament that did not match the persona the first half of life demanded we construct. Individuation, the lifelong process Jung considered central to psychological maturity, requires bringing these exiled parts back into relationship with the conscious self. And this is precisely the work that cannot be rushed, outsourced, or shortcut through external achievement. This is why the success that follows this kind of integration tends to look different from the success that precedes it. A person who achieves prominence before doing this internal work is, in Jung's terms, often still operating primarily through persona, performing a role rather than expressing an integrated self. That kind of success can be real and can be substantial, but it frequently carries a particular fragility, because it was built on a foundation that has not yet accounted for the parts of the person it excluded. The shadow does not disappear simply because it has been ignored. It tends to resurface, in crisis, in dissatisfaction, in the strange emptiness that sometimes accompanies achievement that arrived too easily, too early. Before the self that achieved, it had fully formed. The person who integrates first and achieves second is working with different material. Their success, when it arrives, is not a performance layered over an unexamined self. It is an expression of a self that has already done the harder work of becoming whole. This is why Jung's observation about midlife transformation matters so much here. Not because midlife is magic, but because midlife is simply, statistically. When enough accumulated experience and enough accumulated internal pressure tend to force this integration to completion for people who could not access it earlier. It is worth being honest about the limits of this framework. Jung was describing patterns he observed in psychotherapy, not issuing guarantees about careers, timelines, or external outcomes. Individuation is not a strategy for success. It is a description of psychological development, and the people who undergo it do not all become outwardly accomplished as a result. What Jung's framework offers is not a promise, but a different way of interpreting a particular kind of life, one where external achievement was delayed because something more foundational was happening first. If this describes a season you are currently living through, the sense that you are still becoming someone, even as the people around you appear to have already arrived, Jung's framework offers a reframe worth sitting with. The delay you are experiencing may not be the absence of progress. It may be a different category of progress entirely, one the culture around you was never built to measure or recognize. The architecture being built beneath the surface of a life that looks, from the outside, unfinished, is frequently the architecture that holds. Not because it arrived faster, but because it arrived *true, assembled from a self that had already done the work of becoming whole before it had to perform wholeness for anyone watching. Before this video ends, consider the parts of yourself you have not yet brought into the light, the ambitions you set aside, the sensitivities you learned to hide, the version of you that did not fit the persona you built to get through the first half of your life. What would it look like to begin integrating that part now, rather than waiting for a crisis to force the question? And if your own success has not yet arrived, what specifically do you suspect is still being built beneath the surface, waiting for its moment to become visible?